Welcome to Angloromani with Pricey. I'm Pricey, and in this series I break down some of the terms that are used by Romany people in the context of the United Kingdom, sort of looking at the words themselves as well as the etymology of them, as well as talking about my personal experience growing up with this kind of dialect in my house. If you're new to this series, I strongly recommend that you go watch the introductory video and then come back and watch either this one or any of the other videos in this series. It can kind of be watched in any order, but that will basically break down what the series is and what the series isn't. So in today's video, I am looking specifically at commands that I have distinct memories of my dad hissing through his teeth at me. And being that they're commands, a lot of the terms in today's video will be either verbs or phrases that use verbs. So let's talk about verbs a little bit. Being that Anglo-Romani is a dialect, or more specifically a paralanguage, and it happens within the context of English and Britain and the Anglosphere in general, the conjugation of verbs in the Anglo-Romani paralanguage is very familiar to anyone who speaks English. I gel. He gels. She gels. They gel. I gelled earlier. That ed suffix. I am gelling now. I will be gelling later. Future tense and present tense both having the ing. And moreover, all verbs used in Anglo-Romani are what you call a soft verb. What this means is that the form of the verb doesn't change when you're talking about it in the past tense. You always put an ed on the end of it. There's no special cases where, for example, I fly, I flew. You know what I mean? You don't say I flied, for example. This is called a hard verb. All Anglo-Romani verbs are the kind where you put an ed on the end of it. And with that quick introduction as to how verbs work in Anglo-Romani out of the way, let's get into the actual content. So the first verb we're looking at today is one I've already talked about a little bit in the introduction to verbs, and that is gel. Gel is effectively to go. When I say I gelled, it means I went. If I say he is gelling, he is going. It's a placeholder for the word go or any of its conjugations. However, depending on the context, it can also mean some wildly different things. So it can be used interchangeably with the next two words on this list, which mean to come and to take respectively. It can also mean to get, to give, to run. But for argument's sake, the easiest way to think of it is the condition of something or someone being one place and then being somewhere else. Yeah? It's basically any sort of verb that relates to that changing of state of where something is. But in most contexts, I've always learned it as to go. It's just that conversationally, it's something to be aware of. It can be used in placeholders for different words, but it will make sense in a conversation and you just sort of pick up on it. I never even questioned it growing up. In a way that is very similar to the next two words that are going to show up in this video. Gel, or at least some variation of it, is a very ubiquitous word and is used by Romany people, it seems, all over the world. Or at least, you know, some variation of it. So gel might become jal, for example, in Eastern Europe. And in this, in turn, is not too different from North Indian languages like Gujarati and Punjabi that use jal. So jal, jal, gel. It's a very clear line from what's still used in Anglo-Romani by like people like my dad and all his family, all the way back to North India again. Moving on, the next word we're looking at has a very similar sound and a very similar history, with it also being able to be traced to those same sort of Northwest Indian languages like Gujarati, Hindi and Punjabi, and moreover to Sanskrit. And this is the word lel. Lel effectively means to take and is kind of specifically used for to take, even though I say that a lot of these can be sort of conversationally interchangeable. Lel, in my experience, always means take or something to its effect. Effectively, the other words that lel can be associated with are to arrest, to give, to get, to put, to bring, anything essentially where there is ownership of a thing or person and then that's being changed by a person. That makes sense? You know, those kind of verbs where, you know, if I pick something up and carry it off. To carry, it can also be lel. And then finally we get to vel. Vel is effectively to come, to arrive somewhere, essentially. It can also mean to be or to become in different contexts, but mostly it is to have come somewhere. So it's the kind of opposite of go in effect when you're thinking of it in the context of English, but like I say, conversationally can be sort of interchanged with each other depending on context. Now you just sort of pick up on. Now of the three of these verbs, gel, lel and vel, vel is definitely the one that's been through the most sort of transformation as it's migrated. Effectively in some parts of Europe it gets shortened to av, which sounds nothing like vel, but this in turn came from a root word avel, which is very similar to the Gujarati avo, meaning the same thing effectively. The next word I'm looking at is the word muk. According to the Romany project set up by the University of Manchester that I frequently refer to, this actually means to let something be, to allow it, effectively, to allow, to let, that kind of thing. However, in the context that I'm most familiar with, it was always kind of like muk it. Effectively, leave it alone. Leave it. It's that kind of context. Now I mostly know it. And it did get used in various other contexts, one of which will come up in this video. But it could also, you know, be used by my dad as like, stop that. Again, there seems to be a very straightforward line as to where this term came from, as continental European Romanese tend to apparently use the term mukkel or mukel or something to that effect, which in turn has been traced by linguists, not by me, to the Sanskrit muksate, meaning something to the effect of salvation. But it's not impossible for me to picture a situation where the noun for sanctuary sort of goes through a transformation where it's used as a verb for allowing something, to let something, to leave something, to then effectively have my dad using it in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as leave it alone. Moving on to the next related term, we have the phrase Mokka Konya. Mokka Konya essentially means behave. It can also kind of be used interchangeably for shut up, be quiet, leave it alone. Essentially, it's a really good catch-all term for trying to rein in your unruly kids or telling off your cat when they're meowing for their food 4 hours too early. In the context of my experience with this word, I've never really heard it used as Mokka Konya, but Mokka Konya I have seen written in various places, not just the Romany project. But my dad always used it with this extra little syllable. Mokka Konya. Mokka Konya. Putting that extra ra in between mukka and konya. Mokka Konya. Really just makes it roll off the tongue, and it's just really good for just sort of hissing at your kids. Yeah, I can really see why my dad used this one a lot when I was growing up. Now muk we've already looked at somewhat, and mukka is just another form of muk but with an extra bit for emphasis. Konya on the other hand was a little bit trickier to place. I searched high and low and I couldn't find anything that sort of matched it in terms of its context, and I started to think that maybe it was another case of cant, effectively, you know, just made up words in the context of the British Isles that are designed for disguising your language. But according to the coordinator of the Romany project, and effectively the guy who spearheaded the whole thing and authored much of that dictionary that I keep referring to, Yaron Matras is his name, He cites it as being from early Slavic, an early adoption from early Slavic, and a word meaning quiet. I don't know if this is some form of Proto-Slavic, but it's certainly not anything that appears in any modern Slavic languages. Maybe you know more about this than I do, in which case you can let me know in the comments how Konya sort of ended up in the Romany language from Slavic and which Slavic this might belong to. But all I could find in all of my research was one mention of this guy who seems to know his apples saying it's from early Slavic. So I just have to kind of take his word for it. Yet another word that I perceived growing up to mean shut up was Shunta. It's a good word for that kind of emphasis of be quiet. But as it turns out, it actually means listen, listen up, pay attention, that kind of thing. I just perceived it as meaning shut up because all the context in which I knew it was my dad going Shunta when I was being particularly noisy. Obviously, he was actually telling me, listen, pay attention, stop it. I want to be able to hear whatever's going on. So yeah, I can see how I got confused about that one. And if I look back, it actually makes sense that all the time he used it when I was growing up, he was telling me to listen, to pay attention. Again, it's another word that's very easily traceable to North Indian languages, but this one specifically can be traced all the way to Sanskrit itself. The first part of that word, shun, can literally be traced back to Sanskrit, meaning listen, whereas the ta part at the end is something that's been added over the years for emphasis. So Shunta really was meant to be used as a command. Shut up, we're listening. Once again, I'm ending the list today with my favourite term in the video, and this one is Akai. Again, definitely times where my dad's gone Akai to me, meaning get over here, come here, now. But mostly it was kind of neutrally used, you know, Akai, we're going. Akai literally means come here, come over here, get over here, that type of thing. However, the two words individually are stop here. Hatch meaning stop and Akai meaning here. We'll get onto Akai in a bit, but let's look at hatch first. Hatch means stop, and again, this one can be traced back to, wouldn't you believe it, the North Indian languages. But this time, it's taken a bit more of an evolution. So once again, we start all the way back in that ancient language, Sanskrit, with a term that I believe is going to be pronounced something like akseti or something like that. And this means to dwell. This then goes through the transformation into Ashokan Prakrit, which is another really ancient Indian language from like the 3rd century BC, really old. And then it became Achati there, also meaning to dwell. Then some centuries later, it evolves again in Sauraseni Prakrit into the term Achadi, meaning to remain. So we end up with to dwell, to remain, to stop, the words respectively being like akseti, achati, achadi, hatch. Now as for Akai, that second part of the phrase, meaning here, that one was definitely a little bit harder to pin down. In fact, I wasn't able to find anything conclusive myself. However, I am familiar with a fair bit of Portuguese, Spanish and Italian. That's right, Aqui and Akai have the same meaning, and I don't believe that this one is just a coincidence. I think that this is one of the first words that we've looked at so far in this series that has come from sort of the Western and Southern European neighbours of continental Romany people. This won't be the first time that this happens in the series, but it certainly is one of the first times that we've seen so far. And those are just some of the terms that my dad has kind of hissed at me through his teeth over the years when he's been getting me to be quiet, to behave, to get somewhere, to go somewhere, etc. In the next video in this series, I want to look at adjectives that describe the condition and the state of things. There will be one particular word in that video that is very famous. See if you can guess what it is in the comments below. In the meantime, feel free to like the video if you liked it. Feel free to check out the rest of the channel for other videos like this one, as well as retro gaming and music discussion content. And feel free to subscribe. And until next time, have a good one.